Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. My name is Valerie Barron, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you our next panel, the Poverty Environment Connection, Fostering Collaboration in Environmental Justice. Beginning on my left, we have Cecil Corbin-Mark, the Deputy Director and Director of Policy Initiatives at We Act for Environmental Justice. Steve Fishback is a community lawyer with Rhode Island Legal Services. Al Wong is environmental justice attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And Nikki Sheets is the director of the Center for Urban Environment at the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy at the Thomas Edison State College. We begin today with Cecil, providing us with a broader understanding of what is environmental justice.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all have had a really rich day. My name, as you heard, is Cecil Corbin-Mark. I'm the Deputy Director, and this is what you call Phil, because I realized I should have probably given my PowerPoint presentation, my laptop over a second ago, but I didn't, so I apologize about that. I'm going to start today by giving a fairly quick overview, and I wanted these slides to go up for you about what environmental justice is. My organization has been involved in the environmental justice movement for the last 23 years. We started out as a volunteer organization, but now have moved to being a staffed organization. And it's been a very rich and rewarding field to work in for me. And I think we have it up, almost. More Phil? I thought we were almost done. Okay, there we go. Yay. Okay, cool. Thank you. And so, as a way of sort of grounding our discussion for this particular panel, I'm going to sort of walk us through. This slide is going to give you a sense of the way that the Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice. For them, and for much of the federal government, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations and policies. When you look at a definition like that, obviously, it took EPA a little bit for them to recognize that people had issues about what fair treatment meant, and so they further fleshed out and said, well, fair treatment means that no group of people, including any racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic group, should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, municipal, and commercial operations, or the execution of federal, state, local, and tribal programs and policies. And what does meaningful involvement from that definition mean? For the EPA and much of the federal government, it means that potentially affected community residents have appropriate opportunity to participate in the decisions about a proposed activity that will affect their environment and or their health. The public's contribution can and should influence the regulatory agency's decisions. 3, that the concerns of all participants involved will be considered in the decision-making process. And 4, that the decision makers seek out and facilitate the involvement of those potentially affected. But for those of us who work on the ground in the environmental justice movement, environmental justice is more than just sort of this definition that has been put forth. It is in many respects a hybrid, and I'll come to a slide that talks about what that hybrid is towards the end. But for those of us who work in this movement, it is a movement. It's a social justice movement. It is a movement that is grounded and rooted in communities, and it's grounded and rooted in communities' real struggles to really deal with environmental burdens and to seek greater environmental protection from some of those burdens. But it's not just a US movement, it is actually a global movement. It's a global movement that challenges the disproportionate burden of environmental degradation and pollution on the health, well-being of communities of color and low-income communities. It's a struggle for justice by people of color and low-income folks across this country who bear the brunt of pollution in the US and around the world. And it's a growing awareness that the disparate burdens contribute to disparities in health along race, ethnicity, and social class lines. There have been a number of efforts in this movement to sort of build and solidify the movement's work. In the United States, environmental justice first started coming to the fore in the late 70s and early 80s, and in the 1990s was sort of brought to a climax by the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit held in Washington, D.C. Over 900 residents and people from across the country attended that summit and crafted 17 principles of environmental justice. I would encourage you to Google principles of environmental justice and you can come up with them. After a couple of years of working at the intersection of both community struggles against environmental pollution and toxics and policy, President Clinton, then President Clinton in 1994, issued an Executive Order 12898, which charged 11 of the federal agencies to address the disparate impact of environmental hazards on communities of color and low income. After that, a lot of the agencies got involved with figuring out how they would actually implement or carry out this particular executive order. And NIEHS, the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, in particular, conducted or hosted an interagency symposium on health research and the needs of protecting environmental justice. Again, a series of people attended that particular forum. And the dialogue really, I think, resulted in an appreciation for the importance of community involvement in setting not only research agendas, but also having community residents be specifically engaged in setting policy that would come a little bit later on as well. And it also highlighted the need for funding, not only around the research itself, but for communities to actually be engaged in protecting their own health and the environment. I'm going to skip through these slides. Here's the hybrid slide that I was telling you about. The environmental justice movement is not sort of this entity or island unto itself. It is indeed a hybrid of many different social justice movements across this country and throughout this country's history. It includes the civil rights movement, the indigenous rights movement, the anti-toxics movement, and the environmental movement. And it really fuses those movements together and draws upon many of the strategies, tactics, and tenets of all of them to create this hybrid that we call the environmental justice movement. In so doing, you will find that some of us in the environmental justice movement tend to be a little bit schizoid. We have multiple personalities. We show up on different days sort of wearing our civil rights hat, wearing our anti-toxics hat, wearing our environmental hat. But at all times, we try to bring all of those things together at the table where communities are fighting for their health and well-being. Sometimes it's definitely enough to make your head spin, as in this very famous Edward Munch picture, which has been Simpsonized. And I think that the last thing that I want to say about the environmental justice movement is that it is not, when we talk about environmental justice and we define it, for those of us in the environmental justice movement, it's not just about a social movement, but it is also this perspective that we bring to all environmental issues. It's not that low-income communities and communities of color are dealing with different environmental issues. You know, when you cross the border into my community, West Harlem, it's not that the air is different. Well, it is. It's sometimes dirtier. But it is not that we are dealing with different environmental issues. We deal with air quality issues, we deal with land issues, we deal with solid waste issues, we deal with water quality issues. The difference is, oh, there's a stop. The difference is that the particular burdens that our communities are dealing with are disproportionate. And so we bring a perspective that recognizes that those disproportionate burdens mean that there's a disparate power relationship to the decision-making process of how environmental decisions are made in our country. So I'll stop there, and that lays out our groundwork. Okay. I need to take this out. Okay.
So while I get a little assistance changing the slides back, I wanted to draw everyone's attention to some cards that are on or under your chairs. One of the ways that we have decided to structure this panel today is, do a little dance, is to include you, the audience, as a voice in this discussion. I hope that you will all consider writing a question if one occurs to you while we have these initial introductions, or when it comes time for the discussion, we have some runners with microphones who can come around and facilitate the question asking. So, do you want to go ahead?
Sure.
And I can speak from there.
No, I'm good here.
Okay.
Is the volume all right? Great. Hi, my name is Steve Fishback. I work at Rhode Island Legal Services, which is a LSC program, meaning it receives a lion's share of its funding from the Legal Services Corporation that was established by Congress many, many years ago. I'm here to talk about community lawyering and want to share this model with you because this model, this approach to the practice of law is really applicable to any field, any issue, any broad area of practice. And I want to demonstrate how in the environmental realm, in the environmental justice realm, this approach is really very well tailored to address and to work with community groups to advance their agenda. And I have this nifty little poster which I developed for a talk I gave about a year ago at a conference on environmental justice that EPA did. And it very, very succinctly spells out the elements of community lawyering, and you'll see how this approach has been employed in the environmental justice context. Community lawyering is about building community power. And what that really means is, it sounds like a great slogan, and it is, but what it means is to increase the capacity of community residents to positively influence governmental decision-making. So the goal here is to make sure that the community gets what it wants, put very simply. And there are, as lawyers, many of us just think of our job as like going to court and suing someone, and that's an important part of our work. But there's more to it. When we go to law school, we learn a much wider skill set than just going to court. And I wanted to identify what some of the other legal strategies that are used by community lawyers. But before actually going into the strategies, one thing that really makes community lawyering different is that it's based on establishing a relationship with community partners where you're actually on an equal footing. It's not like you are the lawyer in charge. It is you are the lawyer that is a collaborator and part of a team. And again, this is to again highlight how this approach is applicable to a lot of different issues. As I see it, a community lawyer is part of a team that consists of community residents, community organizers, we lawyers, and what I would call the technical people, which in this context usually are scientists or people with science knowledge who can that the community can rely upon to further advance its agenda. So, I mean, the challenge is assembling these teams, and lawyers are very well suited to deal with technical people because when we go to court, we frequently have to do that anyhow. And we will have relationships with people in the technical community, and because we have to be able to translate to a judge what these technical folks are saying, we are also well suited to translate for community people, although the audience is different. But once you're immersed in the community, I think it becomes much easier for you to help translate what the technical folks are saying to the community. So again, now turning to the community lawyering strategies, again, the most common one is litigation. And in fact, my environmental justice work began when people from our community came to my program and said, the city of Providence wants to build 2 schools on top of the former garbage dump. What do we do about this? And of course, working in a legal services program, we didn't have anyone that did environmental law. So we had to figure out, well, this is a really compelling thing. This is really horrible. What are we going to do? And because the time frame was so tight. From the time that they first announced the site to the time that the actual building was opening, the whole period of time was 6.5 months. So the community came to us well into that process, and we had to like jump and get a lawsuit together, which we were able to do. But I don't really want to, I don't have time to go into the lawsuit, but I just want to mention that litigation, is a tool that we have, and in this context it made sense to use because there was no other resort, there's nothing else we could do. The train had left the station, and so we had to do something. And to make a very long, like I said, a long story short, we wound up winning the case 5 years after the school opened. But what did that really mean? And now I want to get to some of these other things because you'll see what that meant. The second tool is policy research and analysis. And what that involves is fact gathering and packaging it in a way to help advance the community's agenda. So in the environmental, in the suit about the schools, we got money from EPA to do a report that surveyed all 50 states' laws about what was out there to regulate the siting of school relative to environmental hazards. And the research showed that there was hardly anything. In fact, only 5 states had any laws that even had any bearing on that subject. So national advocates got a hold of my report and were able to press Congress to pass a law to direct EPA to establish voluntary school siting guidelines. And so that came out of the lawsuit. It helped raise the profile of the issue, and now EPA has these voluntary guidelines that they've put out for public comment that fortunately had a lot of what we were saying was important for the community. The next one is community education, which you use to try to help inform the community about things it needs to know more about so it can further advance its agenda. In this context, we got additional money from EPA to do a day-long conference on environmental justice, and we established a planning committee of people from the community to say, okay, what do you want this to look like, and what do you want it to do, and we should use this conference for something, not just to have a conference, but to do something else with. And from that conference, we were able to jumpstart the creation of a standalone environmental justice organization, which did not exist prior to getting that money. And then once people were interested in setting up this organization, they called upon me to help them with the transactional work, the next piece, which is, as you know, is getting organizations together, bylaws, tax-exempt status, all of that stuff. And the last one is working with youth, and unfortunately I don't have any time to really talk about that, other than to say that in my work, it often means involving working with law students to try to build the next generation of lawyers who will carry on this work. And it's really important to not lose sight of the fact that we do age over time, and we're not always going to be there, and sometimes we do move on to other things. So it's really important from a capacity building standpoint, to be thinking about creating the next generation. And with that, I will end.
Thank you. Al?
I learned 2 things today, that we're schizoids, and I'm not sure who I'm going to talk to later on, Cecil A or B, and that we age, so I appreciate that. My name is Al Huang. I'm an attorney at Natural Resources Defense Council, which is NRDC. We are a kind of what we call mainstream traditional environmental group. Green group is another word they use for us. And most of our groups were formed in the early 70s in response to increasing knowledge about toxics, about air pollution. Rachel Carson Sound in Spring. I don't know if everyone is familiar with that. She was the first to write about how pesticides can affect an ecosystem. How things that we do affect the different there's a complete worlds are not closed cycles. One thing you do affects another, and interestingly, a lot of it, the early environmental movement started out of health concerns. And I think when most people think about environmental movement now, you think about climate change, you think about charismatic megafauna, which is another word for like polar bears and owls and cute animals that we want to protect. But I mean, there's a lot more to the environmental movement. In fact, I think what's very instructive about the environmental movement is that groups like NRDC, Environmental Defense Fund, another kind of large mainstream environmental group, they were formed in the early 70s in response to many of these young lawyers coming out of law school at the time, seeing how well the NAACP and other civil rights organizations had done in litigating and getting laws in the books to protect civil rights. And the question was asked, why don't we have a law firm for the environment? And that's how many of these groups started, with mainly lawyers. And they began through fighting for legislation and getting the laws beyond. So in the early 70s, we got many of the environmental laws that we have right now that we kind of accept, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. And then we spent the next kind of, after those laws were passed in the early 70s, the next kind of 20 plus years, litigating these cases and then fighting to protect these laws. And there's actually an interesting article, if anyone's interested. It's called The Death of Environmentalism, that was written about, I want to say, 5 or 6 years ago, attacking the environmental movement for kind of losing its roots. Much like the civil rights movement, the environmental movement came out of a grassroots movement. It came out during, the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War protests, a growing labor movement, a women's rights movement. And we've become some will critique, we've become very wonky, policy wonky, and we're losing our connection with the average American citizen, which no one wants dirty air, no one wants to drink dirty water, but somehow environmental issues don't oftentimes come to the level of, top political priorities. We learned this lesson from climate change. I think all of us, most people in this room will say, yes, climate change is happening. And about 2 years ago, we almost got a bill, or a year ago, we almost got a bill passed, a federal bill to address it. But now polling says less than 50% of Americans even believe that climate change is happening. So, so the environmental movement, I think, has a lot of challenges. And I think what is interesting about environmental justice, that's what I work on, is it kind of is going back to the roots of where the environmental movement came from. And it's about connecting to issues that matter to people. And the green groups traditionally have not done a very good job of doing that. In fact, shortly after the first National People of Color Summit, letters were written to all the big green groups, essentially accusing them of being racist, of being very white, elitist. Mainly people who worked in them were highly educated, white, wealthy, or higher upper income, and not addressing issues that impacted most of other parts of American society. And so until the past 10 years, green groups have started to address environmental justice, mainly by hiring staff. And that has created tensions as well from the perspective of, as Cecil was saying earlier and what Steve was saying as well, environmental justice, the justice is defined by the community. And green groups, although we're national groups, NRDC, we represent 1.5 million members across the country, which is incredible because whenever I bring cases like in Tennessee, we'll find members for standing in a small little town, like it has 5,000 people. There'll be an NRDC member there, but we have a lot of members, but they don't really represent kind of what we see in most environmental justice communities. Not only that, most environmental groups, I don't know if you have lawyers here who have ever seen and taken environmental law course, it's always NRDC versus X, Sierra Club versus, it's not community groups. And oftentimes we're representing ourselves as the client, not a community client. So in doing environmental justice for a national group, I think there are several ground rules, that are very similar to what Steve was mentioning earlier. One is that, we don't define what the environmental justice struggle is, the community defines it. And when invited, I believe our role is to provide legal and technical assistance to environmental justice communities in their struggle. So, for example, NRDC, we have lots of lawyers, we have lots of scientists. And so oftentimes for an environmental justice issue, what will usually happen is, communities are usually the best experts of what's happening in their backyard. More so than, a national green group that's based in DC, Washington, San Francisco, and LA. We probably don't know what's happening in communities around the country. And what usually happens is a community will approach us with, a problem. And I just want to give 3 examples of different cases I'm working on to kind of illustrate how it happens. About 3 years ago, actually 4 years ago, we were approached by a community in the South Bronx of New York City, which is one of the poorest congressional districts in the country and has one of the highest asthma rates in New York City. and they were complaining about odors coming from various sewage facilities. And when they first came to us, they actually came to us to challenge expansion of a sewage plant. And as we spent more time kind of vetting through what the problem was, we kind of identified the real problem was potentially a sludge plant, not a sewage plant. And as Steve was saying, I mean, part of community lawyering is, I think a colleague of ours, Veronica Eady, once said, it's more about being an environmental justice lawyer is more about being a plumber than it is kind of doing what you would think. It's really you have to roll your sleeves up, and I mean going to late night community meetings or after normal work hours, and really working with the community to figure out what are the issues that they're concerned about, but also more importantly, I think if they come to you with a problem, trying to figure out what are the different opportunities and possibilities that they have to effectuate that problem, and being not necessarily teachers, but playing the role of facilitating the movement of the expert knowledge that you might have, either technical or legal, and presenting them the information in a way that's clear, where they can make informed choices, and then that directs the final actions taken. I thought I had more time than I had, but unfortunately time is up, and I guess we'll get to questions to cover it. I don't want to take up your time.
Thanks. Al said he didn't want to take up my time. Thank you, Al, very much. Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Nikki Sheets. So with the 6 minutes, I've lobbied for 1 extra minute. I want to say that up front. I've lobbied for 1 extra minute already. With the time I have, I wanted to say, give you some of my personal background because it's a little bit unusual. Valerie wanted me to talk about it for that reason, and then tell you what I'm doing now. And I think in the process, you'll learn a lot about EJ. And let me just say that I just want to clarify this up front. We're all friends up here. So in case you hear me say something, it's all right. We all know each other.
We're friends for now.
But we're friends for now, okay. So I work at Thomas Edison State College. So I come up here and stand because I get nervous when I talk, so I can release energy. I work at Thomas Edison State College. Those are the folks that pay me money. But more importantly, I'm with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. So I'll tell you about that at the end. So a long time ago when I was young, I come from Trenton, New Jersey. I went to school, Princeton undergrad, major in economics, first wave of affirmative action. So I'm a 60s and 70s child, which will become pertinent later. I went to Harvard Law School, and I went out and practiced law as a public interest attorney. I clerked for a judge down in D.C., D.C. Court of Appeals, not the federal court, the local court, like the state Supreme Court. My grades weren't good enough for the federal court. Then I became a legal services attorney in Camden Regional Legal Services. At a program that was called the Reginald Heber Lawyer Community Fellowship. And they're no longer, I bet Steve, do you remember those, Steve? We were called Reggies. Reagan hated legal services. He couldn't cut out legal services, but he cut out the Reggie program because he called us the shock troops of the left. So there are no more Reggies. I became a public defender after that in New Brunswick, New Jersey, for about almost 4 years. So I was a trial lawyer. I was not a litigator. Do you know the difference between a trial lawyer and a litigator? Litigators file motions. We do trials. Are they throwing stuff at me yet? No? Okay, that's fine. Then it got a little bit odd, and I went back to school for science. I won't tell you why, because that's an hour-long discussion with me, my psychologist, and the rest of you. But I went back to, eventually got back to Harvard and went into biological oceanography. So I have a PhD in biological oceanography. I got into EJ by, this is a typical academic move, right? I knew nothing about EJ, but I got into EJ by helping to create and teach a course on EJ. But I think every institution should have a course on EJ. Does Penn Law School have a course on EJ, Valley? Okay, we'll move on from there. So I thought that EJ would be a good way to incorporate my science and law and still work with the same people I was as a public interest attorney. Poor people and people of color. So after I graduated, I worked for a year with the Environmental Defense Fund. I want to apologize to all my EJ colleagues for that. Just kidding, Al, that's all right. Then I worked at a college for a semester, and then I went to Columbia University at Earth Institute as a postdoctoral fellow, and I switched to air pollution. And so I do a lot of air pollution stuff now. And at the time when I was at Columbia in New Jersey, we started the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. Now, the Alliance is unique for at least 2 reasons in New Jersey. It's the only statewide group that focuses, only statewide environmental group that focuses solely on EJ issues, and it's the only statewide environmental group where both a majority of its membership and leadership are people of color. So that gets you to what I'm doing now. So I work at Thomas Edison State College. I run a small policy center. That's a small college no one's ever heard of. This is in Trenton, New Jersey. I run a small policy center, not an academic job. And I really support and I'm part of the environmental justice community. So for example, we are the fiscal agent for the Alliance. It's hard to describe my relationship with the Alliance. I'll just say, I'm the closest thing we have to an executive director. I don't do a good job of that, and I have no power. The Alliance runs by consensus, and that's because we did not want to mimic the hierarchical structure of our oppressors. Yes, you can see we are a bunch of 60s and 70s social activists, right? But so we run by consensus and make decisions by consensus. We really go into 2 areas. We do a lot of policy stuff, but we also do the grassroots stuff that Al was referring to. So I'm heavily involved in the policy stuff. Substantive areas, particulate matter air pollution, climate change, and our climate change policy has been particularly controversial. Now, let me stop here and say, we have a national organization around climate change, the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum on Climate Change. Our fearless leader is right here, Cecil. He didn't tell you that, but he's our coordinator. So we've done national stuff around climate change. We do some state stuff around climate change and some regional stuff. It's been controversial because we have not supported carbon trading. We did not support the bills that were that were attempted to be put through Congress. We have fought with the mainstream organizations over it, sometimes rather bitterly. The other substantive area that we're really involved in now is cumulative impacts. How do you deal with multiple sources of pollution? Nationwide, people are talking about that. We're talking about that in New Jersey also. So that's kind of the policy side. The other side is the technical assistance, technical both like folks like me, and organizing assistance to grassroots organizations. So one thing we did was we raised enough. We're an alliance of groups, so everybody works for someone else. But we raised enough money to hire a statewide coordinator who is an organizer. So he provides the organizing assistance to groups. For example, we're helping a group in Trenton now to fight the siting of a recycling facility. I should say another recycling facility in their neighborhood because we just think it's too much stuff in their neighborhood, Black and Hispanic neighborhood. One collaboration I wanted to mention is within the forum, we have an EJ and Science initiative. And there's an important link between the science and the law in EJ and environmental work. A lot of environmental and EJ work starts with the science. And often you'll see a community that says, we're being inundated with this pollution, we think it's affecting us, and government will do a study and say, well, yeah, you may have that pollution, but it's all right, it's not bothering you. And then we start to look for science. Well, can we get some of our own scientists to look this over or to help us? Can we get some scientists to testify in court? So we formed the EJ and Science Initiative with EJ folks and some scientists, and we're hoping that we'll get that kind of help and we can take stance on important issues together. I'll close with this. You see this slide right here. This is from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. On the y-axis, think of that. So this goes back to cumulative impacts. Think of that as the amount of pollution in a neighborhood, right? So those are small neighborhoods we're talking about. Think of the y-axis is the amount of pollution in the neighborhood, cumulative impacts. The x-axis, you'll see one is race and one is income. Notice the correlation between the amount of pollution in the neighborhood and race. As the number of residents of color go up, the amount of pollution goes up. Notice between income and pollution. As the community gets poorer, the amount of pollution goes up. right? That's why we're all doing this, because that relationship, I mean, it goes further than that, right? But that's kind of the core of it, and that's why more people should be doing this. And in 2011 or any time, that relationship should not be there. The amount of pollution in your neighborhood should not depend on the amount of money you have in your pocket or the color of your skin. And that's really why we are all environmental justice advocates and lawyers. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I see there is a growing pile of questions from the audience. So I guess we'll begin our question and answer session with, I was wondering if, with the question, maybe Cecil, you can start us off talking about some of the challenges that community groups may face working with practitioners and attorneys.
Taking a cue from Al, I'll share with you the things that I've learned. I've learned that we age. I've learned that Al doesn't know who to talk to, and that Nikki needs a shrink, and Penn Law School doesn't have an EJ course. So then I need to ask who's running Penn Law School, because maybe we need to sit down and have a talk. I wanted to just also sort of respond to Valerie's prompt and question about some of the challenges that we face as an organization by sharing with you a little bit of our experience. And as always, I tried to be too ambitious. I wanted to share with you a couple of sort of vignettes about our experience with attorneys over the course of our organization's life. Before diving into that, just to say that one of the things that lawyers do well is that they help maintain power balances, or in some instances, they help shift power balances. And all of our work is really in some ways about allowing the voice of communities that are most impacted, that are on the front line of what Nikki's slide demonstrates, to have more power in an environmental decision-making process that usually brings them a significant amount of burden. So in the examples that I was going to share with you, I was going to be clear about. The first one was with the Center for Constitutional Rights, a nonprofit law firm that very early in the beginning of our organization helped us as an organization and as a community, my community is West Harlem, deal with the fact that another bus depot was being located in our neighborhoods. And when I say another bus depot, I mean this was now to be the 6 out of 8 depots in all of Manhattan that would be located uptown in our neighborhoods. And why are diesel bus depots a problem? Well, diesel bus depots are a problem in a community where you have significantly high levels of asthma, because diesel pollution is a trigger for asthma. There's no causal relationship between diesel and asthma, but it is a known trigger. It's also, in some studies, documented to be a cancer-causing agent. So having so many of those diesel bus depots in a very densely populated, very compact neighborhood, northern Manhattan, where I come from, is about just only 7.25 square miles. And into that neighborhood, you have more than 650,000, or set of neighborhoods, you have more than 650,000 people. We obviously needed to, we raised our concerns with the MTA about putting this diesel bus depot in the neighborhood across the street from a school, across the street from a public housing development, and said this is not the best place for it, and it's not the best place for it for all these reasons. Of course, our community was not listened to, and the decision-making process went forward. We were told that the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, had as of right the ability to put that depot there because they and their predecessors had owned the land and had operated it continuously as a transportation facility, and therefore could put a new diesel bus depot, one of the largest in the city at that time, there. We filed a lawsuit against the MTA, seeking to have them ultimately stop the building of the bus depot, because to make matters worse, they weren't only planning on putting a bus depot there, they were planning on also, as a way of cross-subsidizing the development, building housing on top of that bus depot, but not as if just putting housing on top of the diesel bus depot with the potential health effects that I just talked about was so significant for them. They then wanted to reserve the majority of that housing for families with children and seniors, two populations with the most vulnerable respiratory systems. And so when we tried to impress upon them as a community that, something about this doesn't seem quite too smart, the response was, we're going ahead with the bus depot. So that power imbalance in a planning process, in an environmental decision-making process, we sought to redress with the help of lawyers. What that relationship did was it brought capacity to our very small volunteer organization at that particular point in time that we otherwise wouldn't have had. And so I'm going to look for cues from Valerie because I have other stories that I can lay out. But that was one story that sort of demonstrated our working relationship with lawyers at the very beginning of our organizational history. And there were definite power dynamics in there. These are folks who knew the law, we didn't. But we were firm in our articulation of the outcomes that we wanted. And we were fortunate enough to partner with a group of people who understood the value of the sharing of expertise. Their expertise was in sort of the law and legal tools to help redress this power imbalance. And our expertise was in the impact of these facilities on our communities and our neighborhoods. And that's an expertise that unfortunately in our planning processes, in our legal processes, is totally devalued. And this partnership in some ways helped us redress that. The outcome, and I stop, is that yes, they were able to go ahead with the bus depot, but we did get a permanent moratorium on top of the depot, this housing that ultimately was supposed to be put on top of the bus depot. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those who've submitted questions. A couple of the questions we've received actually speak to some of the points that Cecil was just addressing. One question asker wonders how a community lawyer builds trust, particularly with community leaders, given that many attorneys are not part of the community and are not directly affected by environmental injustice in the same way. And another audience member wonders how we who work with low-income communities and communities of color can find matches with technical expertise on environmental issues. So I'm hoping that we can speak to those questions.
I can probably do both, but I'll let some of my panel, I'll go to the trust one, because that one I think is really important. I think you should think about it like, how do you make and develop a relationship with someone that you want to, someone that you want to live with forever? Well, some of those same strategies are applicable in this context. I mean, first of all, it doesn't happen immediately. It's something that develops over time. And if you think that you're going to be able to rush it, well, just think about when you rush it in the other context. It can be disastrous. But I mean, you really need to spend time physically with people in their own space and listen and do a lot of listening. And that helps build trust. But I think if you think about the trust-building process from a slightly different perspective, I think a lot of it will be somewhat natural to you. In terms of the matching piece, again, because we are professionals, we interact with other professionals. And we know people who to access, whereas our community clients have no clue who to access. I mean, there's a real disconnect there. And one of the most valuable services I think that we can provide as lawyers is, again, to connect community people to the technical resources that they need. And because we know where to go, we can make it happen.
I just want to add to that quickly. I mean, I wanted to give an example. I'm going to answer that question differently. And here's an example of what you don't do, right? So I think in environmental justice, what's really important, I mean, you saw Cecil mention before and highlight any meaningful involvement, right? That was written from a government perspective, right? That's how the government views. That applies the same to relationships with, non-governmental groups and environmental justice communities. So the first part, and that's kind of what Steve was getting at, is really, really engaging on a serious and honest level. I think for lawyers, oftentimes what we see, and I'll give you a quick example of this is why the wrong way to do it, is you see a problem. You might open the LA Times and you see an article about, let's say, tainted candy in California that's coming from Mexico. And it has high levels of lead in it from the wrappers they use, the dye they use, and how they dry. Especially, these were tamarind candies, actually, how they were drying these chilies. And, a lawyer, oftentimes your instinct, you see something like that, and you're like, oh my God, okay, so these candies are coming in from Mexico. There's lead in them. Kids are eating them. In California, we have a law called Proposition 65 that requires labeling and warnings if, products might have. So I'm going to file a Prop 65 lawsuit, and that will protect that community. That's wrong and alienating. I mean, if you go back to, this model, it's, who are you speaking for? Are you speaking for yourselves, or are you speaking for an affected community? We're ready to do it. And in fact, this story actually did happen. I mean, there was a number of environmental justice groups and communities all around California organizing around this issue, where they were pulling these, they were going to local corner store bodegas, pulling these, doing a multi-year effort around this, pulling these candies off the shelves. They're trying to get legislation passed in the state of California to ban some of these candies. And out of nowhere, a green group came in and just filed it. Now, they might have said, that's the right tool. And that's right, that probably was the right tool. And actually, the EJ folks were considering filing a Prop 65 claim, but they wanted to do that. They wanted to time that with their organizing strategy. They wanted to time it with, they didn't want it to threaten the legislation because they're trying to pass legislation, and all of a sudden there's litigation, and then that's going to scare off, a bill from actually getting passed. And I think that's a classic example of right intentions aren't necessarily the right way to do an environmental justice type case. I mean, really what it is about is actually representing directly the needs of that community, and essentially, especially one that they've worked on for a while, one that affects their communities, and it's very patriarchal for someone else to come in and say, we think we know what's right. And what EJ attempts to do is flip that paradigm and have the community speak for itself. And the lawyer is playing that, on tap, not on top.
The only other thing I'll say is that I think it's important in that trust-building relationship to realize that one of the greatest things that you can do is to share capacity and to help build it. It's about transfer. It's not just about you sort of keeping the capacity that you have as a lawyer, but helping that community group in particular, when it's a group, figure out how do we transfer some of that capacity as well. I think that goes a long way to helping build trust in a relationship for the long term.
Let me say something about the science part. I think, how do you find scientists? I think there are groups around the country that have done it on an ad hoc basis. Cecil, part of one at Trinwiac in Columbia. I was part of the group when I was at Columbia. I know there's Southern California. There had been one in Detroit. I don't know if it's still active or not.
Yeah.
But one of the things we want to do in EJ and Science Initiative is to kind of make that a formal process instead of an ad hoc process. Hasn't happened yet, partly because I just don't have the time to pay enough attention to it. We don't have the time as the EJ community. And I wanted to make one comment about that. That's why Cecil's talking about sharing resources. We're severely limited in capacity in the EJ community. There aren't a whole lot of dollars out there for environmental stuff, and at least, maybe more than this, but at least 95% of it goes to the mainstream groups and not to the EJ groups. So in kind of all throughout the EJ movement, this is kind of transfused throughout it, that we don't have capacity. About the trust, let me comment that was an issue for me, because between university and colleges and the EJ community, there has not been a lot of trust, partly because the colleges and universities come in and scoop up the money. And one decision I made early on to gain the trust of folks, even though I look like a lot of people in the communities, I'm still coming from this college, even though no one's ever heard of it, still a college, is that I made a decision to become part of the EJ community as opposed to viewing the EJ community as a client, and just to be there all the time to gain that trust.
Thank you, and thank you for the fantastic questions. I will read one as written. In dealing with some populations, like women and children, environmental issues often take a back seat to issues that seem more pressing to them, like education, healthcare, availability of social services, and government benefits. What is the best way to communicate with these clients that they should care about environmental issues and prepare them to address these issues in their lives?
What is the best way to communicate to these clients that they should care? Who comes into your life and tells you what you should care about? Think about that for a second, right? Usually when people start telling you what you should care about, sometimes you have a particularly negative reaction, and those negative reactions can range on a scale from like, thanks, but no thanks, to like something more violent, right? I would say to you, if you're really concerned about helping the individuals, the communities, the organizations have an intersection, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, an intersection between what you are interested in and what they are interested in, spend some time understanding what they prioritize, and then begin to, after you may help them address what they prioritize, figure out how you may help them connect the two issues. I mean that very sincerely, because if you're starting from the premise that any individual should care about something that you determine to be a priority for them, I think you're running afoul of something that even for yourself you would not tolerate. So spend some time understanding what they care about and why they prioritize it, one. Two, spend some time figuring out how, with your skill set, you can help them deal with what they prioritize. Three, then think about what are the connections between what it is you've prioritized for them and what they've prioritized for themselves, and then start another conversation. So you can see that's a lot of work. So be prepared. That would be my response.
I think maybe to draw out that question a little more, too, I wonder if the panel could speak to when other issues do seem more pressing, how that other issues such as those listed in the question, including education, healthcare, availability of social services, the interplay between those needs and environmental justice concerns. And I think that might help us address some of the other concerns in the question.
So let me just say that I think that for us in the environmental justice movement, far more often than not, we approach environmental issues not necessarily through an environmental per se lens, but it's usually a health lens, because communities are identifying an impact on their health as the real challenge that they're confronted with. Thank you, Valerie, for pushing me on that. That pushed a button for me, so I'll take it back down. A lot of times communities are intersecting with environmental issues because it's impacting their health. That is something that almost all communities have a clearer understanding of versus the sort of world of environmental concerns. And we generally use that as the portal into the environmental movement when people express healthcare concerns. So in the case of the diesel bus depot, it was about respiratory illnesses. People were afraid that the children across the street in the school where the bus depot was proposed would ultimately have higher increased incidences of asthma. And so we began to build around that. In some instances, as an environmental lawyer, you will end up dealing with a wide array of issues. You can be working on transportation one day. You can be working on water quality the next day. You can be working on energy policy the next day. Many of those things, if you look carefully enough, and sometimes you don't even have to look that carefully, have an intersection with public health, which is what Al said when he referenced the fact that that's where the environmental movement really began in some ways, okay? So I would say that might be the way to also deal with that.
I think a good example that illustrates this is I've been doing a lot of work in the Gulf post-Katrina, now post-oil spill. And there's, like, for the Gulf, for example, there are many environmental issues you can worry about, like damage to the ecosystem, damage to wetlands, damage to marine mammals, landfilling of waste, air quality from the oil spill, seafood safety, worker health and safety. And for an environmental group like us to kind of get involved, I think it gets to sort of what Cecil was saying earlier about. I mean, EJ it's not it's hard work. I mean, you have to. I mean, it's like community work. I mean, I always feel like good EJ lawyers have some type of organizing experience or background, because you need to be a organizer to a certain extent. Understand, that, I mean, to bring people together, you don't just call out into an empty room and they all run to you because of the issue. I mean, people come to you or you go to them because you build relationships and you build trust. And so the oil spill, for example, there's all those different issues, and then there are issues that exacerbated them. For example, they're maybe not environmental. For example, the lack of the health disparities of healthcare in the Gulf area generally, lack of general services in the Gulf area. I mean, the claims process, lack of ability, legal assistance through legal services. I mean, again, going back to the health disparity, not having health clinics available. And I think for the environmental aspect of it, I mean, one of the ways that you try to address, EJ, when you try to address those is by helping to identify where those gaps are. For example, fine, there's a health disparity, but what's missing in the health disparity? Yeah, obviously it's healthcare, but the other side is, well, if people are being exposed to oil or dispersants and they think they're getting sick, even your typical physician wouldn't be an expert for that. You really need like an environmental exposure expert. And so what would you recommend for that community? So, well, we need to help work with you to build the expertise of environmental health exposure experts and bring that type of healthcare to the. And so I think and then working with labor as well. I mean, you're always balancing kind of different issues. I mean, like most Gulf states are right to work states, so there's not organized unions. I mean, if you look at post 9/11 and how a lot of the firemen and cleanup workers were able to get. Well, not maybe finally get, but fought really hard to get, compensated for what happened to them when they were working and got exposed to asbestos in the air. I mean, you look at the unions played a key role in that. You look at the Gulf region, and they don't have that same network, and because of that, people are afraid to speak up. So the role of the environmental justice lawyer in that perspective is to. I mean, I think one thing we did was we brought down the 9/11 folks and here's how they were able to work. Here's how they got first line clinics. And so I think a part of it is convening and it's being an organizer before you even get to, is there a legal hook to address the problem? I don't know if that answered your question, but different question.
And I think that I don't think the issue is not, so Cecil talked very eloquently about, right? Can't tell people what their problems are. But I think the experience in New Jersey has been people know what the problems are because it affects their public health. And they know there's stuff out there that shouldn't be out there. And they have formed groups in New Jersey, and we're in alliance organizations. About 3 or 4 of our organizations are grassroots groups. And I think what the environmental justice movement does, and now before it gets to the lawyer and then you get to the lawyer, is we can sometimes put it in environmental justice context for them in the overall context, like put in the context of what you're facing in your community is happening all over the state of New Jersey. But then I think a challenge is that grassroots group who is formed in Camden over the cement plant in Camden, once that fight is over, which may take years, but how do you maintain a movement beyond that, and how does that get translated into policy that will affect state and national? Because folks got to work all the time. They know what's killing them, but they got to work. They got to do all these things, and I think that's when the professionals like us come in. And then you face the problem of, okay, are we still connected to community, and who are we? And that gets you in a whole round of other issues. But I think that's the larger issue: is how do you keep momentum going? How does it translate into policy? And for the long run, how do you keep it going?
Thank you. Steve, we have a couple of questions up here for you, so I'll invite you to begin, and then others can chime in. Some of our audience members are wondering about the place of civil rights laws and the civil rights movement in the legal challenges involving environmental justice. And I know that's something that you've given a lot of thought to. I hope you can speak to that. And some others are wondering how organizations, what laws are in place and legal avenues for change are available for communities, such as low-income communities, primarily recent immigrant residents, whose children must attend the schools that were built on these dump sites prior to the passing of these new laws.
Could you just repeat the second part of that? I'm sorry. Okay.
It's like what's available for
the immigrant community to fight some of
In
them
the school setting.
in the school setting context.
Good question. Well, as good lawyers, we make things up. This will be my short answer. One thing I didn't say at the beginning is that I view environmental justice as the practice of environmental poverty law, and legal services' mission is to. We are poverty lawyers, are really anti-poverty lawyers. So this kind of work fits very well into the mission of legal services. It just seems to have gotten lost in the shuffle because unfortunately our institution is fairly slow to adapt to change. That's why all you young folks need to go into legal services and help change our organization. As to the laws, the case was filed under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bars recipients of federal funds from discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin. The case was filed in 1999 prior to a decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, which some of you may be familiar with, Alexander versus Sandoval, which held that the disparate impact regulations that every federal agency promulgated under Title VI, those regulations said that no recipient can undertake any actions that have the effect of discriminating or disproportionately impact people on the basis of race, color, or national origin from conducting those activities. Well, the Supreme Court ruled in the Sandoval case that those regulations were not privately enforceable, and thus the only way that you could proceed under Title VI was to prove discriminatory intent, which under the case law that exists is next to impossible. No plaintiffs have been prevailing on an intentional discriminatory theory since the Sandoval case, and I think even before Sandoval, I can only think of one case in the late 70s or early 80s in Florida where they were able to prove intentional discrimination. We fortunately had a law in Rhode Island that directed our state's agency to consider the impacts on low-income communities and communities of color, the environmental equity impacts when developing cleanup plans for contaminated sites. So that is what gave us the hook. And at trial, the 6-week trial that took place in the case I didn't get a chance to talk about because I don't agree with this litigator trial lawyer dichotomy because I'm both and more, that we showed that the agency did nothing. And consequently, when we won, we got an order that required our agency to develop policies on environmental justice and community involvement. That was one of the gains that came out of the case. And so, new immigrants would be covered by that law because they are, people of color for the most part. But on a national basis, as I said, because of what the Supreme Court has done with Title VI, from the standpoint of federal law, it's much more difficult. The only other federal law that can somehow come into play here is the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires that environmental impacts be considered. It doesn't mean how they get considered, it's just that you've got to show that there was some consideration. Environmental justice advocates have been, pressing for an environmental justice impact analysis as part of those, and we've gotten a lot of traction on that, and that's an area where I think lawyers can be very helpful to community folks.
Just one thought on the different types of laws you can use. I think there's roughly 3 different categories of law. There's actually a great law review article about Robert Kuhn that was written a long time ago. I want to say dating us, but I want to say maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where he talks about, there's procedural justice is one type of litigation you might get out of EJ. So what's procedural justice? It's like lack of information. So your Freedom of Information, Right to Know Act kind of laws, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, FOIL, access to information, and then, was there appropriate notice for a hearing? Was the hearing held in English? Do they hold it at a time that people can actually attend? Do people have access to that process, right? Was the process done correctly? Did they jump through all the hoops? I would put in the procedural justice kind of, silo too, the environmental review statute. So those are like, there's not just a national environmental policy act, there's also state mini NEPAs, they call them, where for state, not all states have them, But when a state, when they're engaging in an activity, they have to do an environmental impact analysis. Most of what you get out of that's procedural. Usually it doesn't kill the project. It just means they have to consider all the potential impacts, including many times environmental justice and cumulative impacts, and then either mitigate them or identify why they're not going to mitigate them. It might not stop the project, but oftentimes it can delay the project, and maybe there's financing that falls through, or you get a settlement or community benefits agreement out of it, or you just get the fact that they actually did what they were supposed to do, procedural justice. Then there's like something like just distributional justice, and that's like, why are there more here? And I put the civil rights laws in that category, and Title VI, Steve mentioned, is one of them. Actually, there's a case I'm working on with co-counsel with NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Dixon, Tennessee, where we're bringing an environmental cleanup case under RCRA, and they're bringing a Title VI civil rights intentional discrimination case, and they actually have a pretty darn good case. There might be another case coming down the pike. But those, and I would also put
Facts too.
I would also put Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, in that category, which does recognize a private right of action for disparate impacts. And there's been several great cases around that. There's also been a lot around transportation Title VI type cases because federal money, and where they spend it. So there's distributional, I would put that. Then there's like another bucket, which I would say, your environmental laws, which, for most of them don't really, I like RCRA, Section 7002 of RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, because the remedy is they have to abate the endangerment that's being caused by a hazardous solid waste. That is a good justice solution. The justice solution is usually, I don't want the facility, I want to get rid of the contamination, not I want them to jump through all the hoops and the facility still gets built, or they meet their permit and it's still there, which are some of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act type cases. So those are kind of enforcement. Then the last one is kind of like these common law angles, and nuisance is one of them.
Public health nuisance.
And public and private nuisance. Most private parties don't have standing to bring public nuisance. I still haven't figured out what that standard even is for standing. But for private nuisance, though, it's a very effective tool to use. It's a great narrative. A lot of these cases, you got to think about the narrative you're also building around. The law is one thing, but do you have? In the end, these are all stories, and when you're going into a court, you're telling a narrative, and a lot of times these environmental cases, as we've all talked about, get really technical. It's about do they meet the maximum achievable technology they include? Whereas these, civil rights cases, the nuisance, it's very factual based on there's expert debate on science and technical facts, but still the narrative is usually, American, property as American as apple pie, it's been interfered with because of odors, because of noise, because of and oftentimes in those cases, you can seek money damages, but most EJ clients will usually not want that. They want injunctive relief. They want to stop the problem. And you go into a court, and that's a lot of credibility you go, and you're not asking for personal injury damages. So, there's the common law ones, and then kind of your administrative procedure, getting involved in the commenting process, which then you can challenge later on, but they're very difficult to do.
I just wanted to say that NRDC partnered with us at another stage in our development, also very early on in the organization, to use in New York City our public and private nuisance law to help us deal with a sewage treatment plant that had been built on our doorsteps. A sewage treatment plant in a city where the vast majority of the sewer system runs on gravity, and you might wonder, why am I pointing out that little minutia for you? Harlem has communities called Morningside Heights, Hamilton Heights, and then beyond that, Washington Heights. So when you get to the northern part of Manhattan, when you get uptown, it gets higher and hillier. And last I checked, gravity goes down, not up. And so if you put a sewage treatment plant in a neighborhood like Harlem, you're then putting it in one of the highest parts of Manhattan. That's a decision. It's about power. It's about the fact that our communities had to bear a particular burden because it's not just our sewage that's being treated in that particular plant, but it treats communities like Tribeca, where Robert De Niro lives, or Riverdale, a very wealthy community in New York City. Trump Towers, yeah, exactly.
Classy.
So, that community had to bear the burden of the odors. My community had to bear the burden of the odors when Robert De Niro sort of flushed his toilet. We also had to bear the issue of the fact that the sewage treatment plant was powered by diesel fuel. Remember diesel from the earlier story? Anyway, so that was an opportunity for us to use the public and private nuisance laws to actually get them to fix the sewage treatment plant and to make particular kinds of ameliorative benefits to the community.
Two things. I wanted to say, first of all, that Al and Steve are not only litigators, but trial lawyers, of which I'm neither anymore, of course. Then the second point is that what would help tremendously with the legal part is if government lawyers were much more aggressive in this. I talked about the cement case, and Steve referred to the 1999 case under Title VI. That was in Camden. And the three of us are probably EJ Attorneys Group that meets every so often and talks about legal theories with respect to EJ. And the lawyer that brought that case is part of our group. And she won with the substantive case, right? It was only this legal technicality standing with the reason she lost, the community lost. And what I argued to DEP, what I've argued for a long time, because they were some of the people that were sued in that case, is that DEP in the state of New Jersey should have been on the side of the community, right? They should have been looking at novel, well, not even novel legal theories. They should have been aggressive enough to take the community side in that case. And it was proven that that legally it was right, or it was, mainstream enough to be won because Olga did it, but they were on the opposite side. So if we had the government lawyers on our side, if we had, all the state U.S. Attorney Generals and U.S. Attorney and the Justice Department, it would be, I think, a lot easier. I'll look to the litigators trial. I think it would be easier than.
Sometimes you get lucky because after suing our state agency, they eventually became our ally and are now with us proposing a law in Rhode Island that would ban the siting of schools on sites where vapor intrusion is an issue. That's a sort of a technical thing, but there was this transformation that occurred too, which I just want to say is still possible.
That's why the narrative is important,
Yes.
because we're trying to move power. We're trying to shift the picture and the power balance that impacts our communities.
Just so everyone here knows, he was referring to Olga Palomar from Camden Legal Services, and she's right over the bridge here. So if folks here are interested in EJ-related issues, you have a very well-regarded EJ lawyer right on the other side of the bridge. I often forget that.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little, and someone is asking, is there tension between environmental concerns facing minority or low-income communities and those facing the nation at large? And if so, how can this tension be reconciled in the policymaking of federal and state agencies? How should these agencies prioritize between addressing larger, more broadly hitting concerns versus serious concerns affecting only small segments of the population? And I was hoping, it's a loaded question to begin with a lot to say, but I was hoping we could also add a discussion of how groups representing those different constituencies find challenges working together and successes working together.
Where do we start with this?
Do you want to?
I guess I'll start since the target's on. Of course, it's 90% of my headache most of the time, and the fires I have to put out. But I mean, that is true. Like national groups have strategies that oftentimes run counter to environmental justice communities' priorities. Why is that? Is it because the groups are racist or they don't care? I once, John Adams, who's the founder of NRDC, he actually just got the Presidential Medal of Honor, like about a month ago, from President Obama. But I mean, he used to have a saying, and again, I respect him with every shred of my body. But he said, in the end, we're going to be remembered for whether we saved that mountain or not whether we included everybody in that process. And I think, to most part, a lot of the old traditional environmentalists think that way. It's like climate change is a great example. It's like, there's a zillions of different, environmental problems and issues, but they're like, this is the biggest one. This is the one that's going to, you can tie to everything. It's going to, lead to complete Armageddon. I'm just kidding. Complete Armageddon. And, this is the most important thing but not that if we work on this issue, we also get co-benefits of actually, we reduce greenhouse gases, we hopefully reduce other criteria pollutants at the same time. I mean, there's no single pipe that just puts CO2 out. It's usually CO2 plus NOx, SOx, PM 2.5, and other nasty stuff. And so they have that, and they're thinking, well, if we don't address that, then all these other problems, are dwarfed. That put flies in the face of what environmental justice is about. And I think oftentimes it's difficult to join those two sides. I think, I hear arguments that are correct on both sides. I mean, if, for example, if you're trying to pass a climate bill in this kind of political climate, you've got to make compromises. And then an environmental group has to decide, do we want to stay on principle? And it doesn't mean they didn't choose to stay on principle, but do you make compromises? For example, subsidies for nuclear, which doesn't sound like such a great idea right now. Supporting carbon capture sequestration. Does that mean more coal plants? I mean, but they're going to build the coal plants anyways. We can't stop all of them because all the coal states, and we're not going to win that political battle. So we have to make it okay somehow. But so they capture the CO2 and pump it to the ground. That's better than. So you make all these different decisions. Carbon tax. That's what environmental justice groups took a position and supported. From the green group perspective, they were like, most people within green groups would say, I love that idea and I would love more regulation. Are we going to get that? No. So, and some would even argue that, and I'm not saying it's true, that a cap and trade or cap and fee, whatever they want to call it, was almost identical to a tax. I mean, if you look at them from the principle, one has a cap, one doesn't. It's all about what price you set, right, and how you enforce that. Now, I think oftentimes what ends up happening are, the main problem is, okay, so I'm kind of outlining the conflicts. The main problem, though, is that, green groups also, there's there's many EJ groups, and there's also many green groups that all have their siloed issue areas too, like just water, just like forest issues. For example, a lot of the green groups were fighting with Conservation International, who wanted to put offsets into the federal climate bill, which essentially allows, instead of, if you're going to emit CO2, instead of doing that, you plant trees somewhere else. Very tough science to, confirm whether you're actually canceling that out. But there's other environmental groups that do forest conservation that are like, we need to do that. We need to save rainforests. What a great opportunity. So they don't always even get along. And there's a lot of those groups too. Green groups fighting over everyone's competing issues. And unfortunately what happens, and I think Cecil hit the nail on the head, it's power dynamics in the end. It's not that they don't care about the EJ groups, it's that, who has more power and influence. If NWF, I'm not saying this is right, NWF has a lot of influence with the legislator, I'd probably cave to them. An EJ group, they might say, well, hey, listen, how many groups do we have to talk to? How many more people is that bringing to the decision-making table? And those are not right. I am fighting those all the time internally. They're not the right ways to do things, but I think what it illustrates is that the movement as a whole has a lot of work ahead of them to really kind of look at itself and what are all the different parts of movement. And we've learned we can't win on our own. The climate bill was a classic example. We got our butts kicked, right? We can't win on our own.
Say that again.
So, you need to work together, whether it's with interfaith groups, EJ groups, health groups, labor, and I think that is the lesson that needs to be learned from, a climate being a classic example of that.
In any story, the answer to the question is yes, there is tension. In any story where you have haves and have-nots, there's tension. The have-nots want sometimes what the haves have. And in this instance, what the haves have, meaning the mainstream green groups, is that they have the ability to make policy happen. They have the ability through their resource base to totally direct, in many instances, the policy-making conversation. And that policy-making conversation has very direct impacts on us in the environmental justice communities. Now, to be fair, we have not always been our own best allies and advocates in the environmental justice movement. I think over the last couple of years, decade or a half or so, we've gotten better at recognizing how to marry our organizing efforts to our policy-making efforts. And I think that our friends in the mainstream green movement, particularly around the climate change issue, are coming slowly to recognize the value that we have as part of this broader environmental tent. And that is that our efforts are rooted in communities, are rooted in things that impact people. And if we're ever going to have solid policies, to me, one of the hallmarks of that is that the public is accepting of those types of policies. And so we're on the cap and trade issue, the mainstream green groups failed. It's not so much that we in the environmental justice movement prevailed, but where they failed is that they did not find a policy that could be supported by a broad enough popular movement. And that, to me, will always be an Achilles heel for the environmental movement. And these tensions will, in some ways, continue. But I think the last thing I'll say about this, it's helpful to have more people like Al inside the environmental mainstream groups, because you, at some point, have a person who can serve as a mediator for some of these tensions. The Environmental Justice Leadership Forum that Nikki referred to, that I helped convene with Nikki's help and other people's help, Al has helped us over the years in this as well, brought many of the green groups together, to talk about things like co-pollutants, something that Nikki is very fond of. We call Nikki co-pollutant sheets. And we were told by the green groups, well, that's too heavy of a political lift. Well, that's clearly not true. I mean, you have this massive conversation about cap and trade moving, and you have the resources. It's what you want to prioritize, and the tension often comes from being able to always set the agenda. So yes, there is a little bit of glee on some of us when we see some of that agenda that doesn't agree with our policies, because we see significant impacts on our communities as a result of potential policies or what's proposed. When it fails, we do get a little gleeful. So yes, there is tension, but we do work together, and I think that's important, because we, as Al said, can't get it all done by ourselves.
And let me just highlight what Cecil said at the end. Part of the problem is that a lot of the compromise the Green Group makes seems to sacrifice communities of color and poor communities, right? There's a core of the issue, is that when the Green Groups wouldn't go to bat for a co-pollutant issue that maybe didn't sacrifice our communities but had the ability to greatly help them, they were willing to not support it or then bargain it away. Those are our communities that are being bargained away. Take CCS, for example. CCS sounds great for climate change. It buries the, as long as it doesn't somehow kill us all, okay. Even if it works,
Bubble
right?
up like in Cameroon.
Yeah, it may help climate change, bury the carbon dioxide, but it also emits local pollution. Guess where most of those plants are probably going to go? In EJ communities that have too much pollution. So then you're sacrificing those EJ communities on the local level for the greater good, right? That plant's probably not going to be built in, I don't know the fancy neighborhoods here, but in Princeton or Short Hills, New Jersey, in upper income neighborhoods, and put the local pollution there. It's going to be built in our communities. There's already one planned for Linden and the EJ community in New Jersey.
That's not even talking about the fact that those CCS plants are going to use more energy to actually extract and bury
coal.
the. but who's counting?
But that tends to be the general problem, though. We see our communities being the ones as being sacrificed.
Well, as we can all see, there is plenty more to discuss on this issue. And I think
And we like Al, though.
Yeah, someone watch my back after this.
Well, had we known Nikki co-pollutant sheets, we would have put it on your name tag. But I invite everyone who asked a question and we didn't have time to address it, or didn't ask a question and thought of one in the process, to come up and discuss with our panelists. But we don't want to stand between you and your lunch, which is the next item on our symposium schedule. So I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know each of you, and I really appreciate your participation today, and I really appreciate the participation of the audience. So you join me in thanking our panel, and we can move on to lunch.
We definitely want to say thank you to Valerie for her efforts in pulling us all together. I know it's been a chore, but thank you, and thank you to all of you.
Pleasure.